Hey guys, welcome to the Liberal Hive Mind, a channel solely focused on exposing the abundant hypocrisy of the left. What happened, California? What happened, little Gavin Newsom? You're constantly going on about how great California is. We have the greatest economy, the greatest social programs. It's the greatest place on planet Earth. You MAGA chud Republicans can't compete with us. And they always say the same thing. They always mention the same thing. California, year on year, is running a surplus. You can't tell us that we're being irresponsible with our money and all of our social programs when we're running a budget surplus every year. Well, not so fast. Let's just say that statement, that claim, isn't exactly aging well these days. It turns out that California is dying. And of course, we've known that on surface level from a cultural perspective. We've seen the businesses fleeing, we've seen people fleeing. It's the most fleed state in the nation as disgruntled California residents flee to the greener pastures of literally anywhere that's not California. But it goes beyond that. We're now learning that California isn't running a surplus at all. In fact, California is supposedly $22+ billion in debt. Yep, a California surplus. All these California leftoids crapping all over red states, claiming they're so much better at managing money. Look at us, we're a blue state with all these social programs and we're running a surplus. That argument, that talking point is officially dead. Let me show you guys exactly what I mean. Another example of leftoids running a cash cow directly into the ground. We got some stuff to get into, so let's roll the tape. Alright folks, take a look at this headline. After years of budget surpluses, California is headed towards a $22.5 billion deficit. Sacramento, California, from a budget perspective, the first 4 years of Governor Gavin Newsom's time in office has been a fairy tale, a seemingly endless flow of money that paid to enact some of the country's most progressive policies, while acting as a bulwark against a tide of conservative rulings on abortion and guns from the US Supreme Court. But just days in his second term, the dream appeared to be ending. Tuesday, Newsom announced that California likely won't collect enough money in taxes to pay for all of its obligations, leaving a $22.5 billion hole in its budget. The deficit was not a surprise. Newsom and the state's budget writers have been signaling for well over a year that California was sailing into economic headwinds. The news on Tuesday was Newsom offering his plan of what to do about it. Notably, Newsom chose not to dip into the state's $35.6 billion savings account, and he proposed no significant cuts to major programs and services, including vowing to protect programs that pay for all 4-year-olds to go to kindergarten and cover the health expenses of low-income immigrants living in the country without legal permission. Instead, Newsom plans to delay some of the spending while shifting some expenses to other funding sources outside of the state's general fund. He has proposed $9.6 billion in cuts, including canceling a planned $750 million payment on a federal loan the state took to cover unemployment benefits for those who lost their jobs during the pandemic. Whether that plan holds will depend on what the state's finances look like after April 15th, when most residents file their state income tax returns. Newsom and legislative leaders don't have to approve a spending plan until the end of June. The fairy tale is over. This idea that you can just endlessly spend money and get nothing in return, this idea that you can just subsidize people's lives, that you can enable homelessness, and even go to the extent of subsidizing people's drug addictions, that you could also incentivize and subsidize illegal immigrants and illegal immigration. The woke California dream is over. And that's exactly what it was all along, a dream, a mirage. Remember, not too long ago, Gavin Newsom was promising checks for everyone. Inflation has gotten bad, folks, and we're going to tackle this inflation by injecting more monies into the California economy, the stupidest thing anyone could have ever imagined. Well, would you look at that? Could you imagine that? It turns out that all of these ridiculous, irresponsible, woke policies that Gavin Newsom told you the state could afford because they're the greatest state on earth with non-stop budget surpluses, it was all bogus from the start. They couldn't afford it. They can't afford it. And California is now going broke. They have $36 billion in the state coffers, and they're expecting a $22.5 billion deficit next fiscal year. If that continues, well, that $36 billion state saving fund, in the end, isn't going to come close to covering the state's liabilities. But of course, in the end, reality, common sense, always ends up winning. And the first stuff to get cut are the nonsense, garbage, activist spending plans. Newsom appeared somewhat pessimistic about the the future as he scaled back some of his ambitious climate proposals, cutting his much heralded 5-year, $54 billion investment to $48 billion. Newsom tried to downplay that cut, arguing the $48 billion is still one of the largest climate investments in the world, and that the state would seek to recover some of that lost money from other sources. Still, it was enough of a cut to anger some climate groups who had been heartened by the state's commitment to combating climate change in recent budgets. It's a reality setting in, and now Gavin Newsom is forced to cut a bunch of the social programs because California can no longer afford it. That's what happens when you implement these kinds of programs, and it's not just the programs themselves, because California in the past could have actually afforded many of these programs, but they overstepped their boundaries. California is one of the most privileged places on earth. I mean, just geographically alone, the fact that they're so close to Asia, and they control a massive port on the western coast, it makes them an economic powerhouse. Then, of course, they have Hollywood. California is the cultural empire of the world when it comes to entertainment. When it comes to tech, there's Silicon Valley, finance, everything, every industry you could think of. California has it all and bigger than anyone else. The amount of taxes that they're pulling in from these massive tech companies and all the industry puts them in a very privileged position. But they have let the state degrade to such an extent that now so many people are leaving. People are struggling to survive, and especially businesses are struggling to survive. And now the whole thing is crumbling down before our very eyes. This is what happens when you go too far, when you get too cocky. And this is probably why Gavin Newsom spent millions of dollars running TV ads in Florida, begging people to come back to California. It's another case of getting woke and going broke, shifting your priorities to all of these fairy tale la-di-da plans, instead of running the state with basic fiscal responsibility philosophy. You know, the article mentioned that Gavin Newsom during his first 4 years ran a surplus every year. It was a miracle, an economic miracle. Well, maybe he just took over a state with an economic engine that was firing on all cylinders. And on his watch, since elected governor, is it a coincidence that during those 4 years, with all the garbage policies that they've implemented, that all of a sudden California is on its way to a massive deficit, massive debt, going broke? Of course not. Correlation is causation. Gavin Newsom doesn't get credit for running surpluses and being a great governor. Gavin Newsom gets credit for taking a state that was running a surplus and running it into the damn ground, like the good communist he is. It's literally the opposite of Governor Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis takes the state of Florida to the lowest unemployment rate in history, and even with collecting very moderate amount of taxes, and that includes a 0% state income tax, with the little taxes that they do collect on sales, home ownership, and from other sources, he's managed to actually bring the state to running a surplus, stacking billions of dollars in the state's rainy day fund. One heralded Democrat governor takes a state that's booming and turns it into a bust, and the top Republican governor takes a massive state and does the exact opposite. California is a failed socialist experiment, and it's really no surprise at all. That's what I got for you guys, though. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to leave a like and possibly subscribe to the channel if you guys are up for it. I'm gonna get out of here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.